Hey everyone, today we're trying something a little different. I found a few creepy stories from around Reddit and I've decided I'll give it a shot. So get comfortable and let's get into the first one. This story is from r/paranormal subreddit and the title is I woke up from a dream that said, "Do not go to sea." The next day this happened. The woman who wrote it thought she had avoided the warning by changing her plans. But by the end of the next day, she wasn't so sure. A few days before writing the post, she and her boyfriend went camping together. They had also planned to spend some time paddleboarding, something they both enjoyed and had done before. Originally, they wanted to take their boards out onto the sea, but the night before they were supposed to go, she had an unusually vivid dream. In the dream, she was holding an old satellite phone. Without warning, it began ringing loudly in her hands. A green light started flashing, and then a message appeared on the screen. It contained only 5 words. "Do not go to sea." When she woke up, she remembered the dream with unusual clarity. It didn't feel like one of those random dreams that disappears after a few minutes. The phone, the green light, and the message were all still very clear in her mind, so she told her boyfriend what had happened. They both agreed that it was strange, but neither of them knew what it was supposed to mean. They decided not to paddleboard on the sea after all. Instead, they chose a river farther inland, assuming that would be the safer option. As far as they were concerned, they had listened to the warning. No ocean, no problem. Which, yeah, sounds reasonable enough. If a dream specifically tells me not to go to sea, I'm probably choosing somewhere else, too. However, what they didn't realize until later was that the river they had chosen eventually connected to the ocean. That detail didn't seem important at the time. The weather looked good, the water was calm, and everything felt completely normal when they began. For a while, there was no reason to believe anything was wrong. Then, without much warning, the weather changed. A powerful wind appeared, and the water became rough and difficult to control. The river that had seemed calm only moments earlier was suddenly choppy, and there was nobody else nearby to help them. She ended up completely soaked, and the temperature began affecting her very quickly. The only way back was to paddle against the current. Every bit of progress required more effort, while the wind and moving water continued pushing against them. She was cold, exhausted, and becoming increasingly frightened. At one point, she says she genuinely felt like giving up, but stopping wasn't really an option. They still had to reach safety. Eventually, after what must have felt much longer than it really was, they managed to make it back. She was freezing, completely drained, and says she was suffering from mild hypothermia, but both of them had made it out of the water. The immediate danger was over. Only after everything had calmed down did the dream return to her mind. The old phone, the green flashing light, and the warning telling her not to go to sea. Then she remembered that the river they had chosen was connected to the ocean. And suddenly, changing locations didn't feel quite as separate from the warning as it had before. All right, to be honest, I don't know what I'd make of this either. Weather can change quickly, especially when you're out on open water, and the connection between the river and the ocean may have been nothing more than a coincidence. But having such a specific dream the night before, remembering it clearly enough to change the plan, and then ending up in real danger anyway, yeah, that would stay in my head for a very long time. The crazy part isn't only that the dream appeared to warn her, it's that she believed she had listened. She avoided the sea, chose a river instead, and thought she had found a safe compromise. But whatever the dream meant, it apparently wasn't satisfied by a technicality. Of course, maybe it was an extremely lucky coincidence. Maybe her mind had noticed something she hadn't consciously processed and turned it into a warning while she slept. Or maybe some dreams are worth taking a little more seriously. But seriously, guys, always listen to those weird gut feelings. Sometimes your mind knows something is wrong before you even step outside. Okay, so the first story began with a warning that may have saved someone's life. And the next one also begins with a warning, except almost everyone assumes it must be a mistake. The post is from r/nosleep subreddit and is called Public Safety Notice. And by the time people finally understand what the alert means, it may already be too late. The emergency alert arrived at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. The narrator's phone vibrated so loudly against the bedside table that it woke them up. At first, they assumed someone was calling. Instead, a A notification covered most of the screen. Public safety notice. Residents experiencing numbness, involuntary movement, disrupted sleep, or unusual repetitive behavior should remain indoors and await further guidance. Do not restrain affected limbs. That last sentence was the part that didn't make sense. The narrator read the message twice, took a screenshot, and sent it to the family group chat. Their dad responded first, asking what kind of warning that was supposed to be. Their mom followed with a laughing emoji. Both parents were downstairs watching television, so the narrator got out of bed and went to speak with them. Dad assumed someone had hacked the emergency alert system. He said there would probably be an apology by morning. When the narrator asked why the warning specifically told people not to restrain their limbs, he joked that everyone's arms were preparing to revolt. Mom reached for a packet of biscuits and said, "Mine already has. At the time, it was funny." They joked about the message for another minute. There was nothing about it on the news. And no sirens or emergency vehicles outside. Online, people were sharing screenshots and making the same kinds of jokes. Some claimed the warning had only appeared in certain parts of the city. Others thought it had been intended for a hospital and accidentally sent to the general public by midnight. The narrator had stopped thinking about it. The next morning, the narrator woke to 3 missed calls from their friend Danny and more than 20 unread messages. They didn't check them immediately. The television downstairs was much louder than usual, and when they reached the bottom of the stairs, they saw both parents sitting silently on the sofa. A news presenter was reporting on a possible neurological condition. Hundreds of people had arrived at hospitals after experiencing numbness, muscle spasms, and temporary loss of control in one or more limbs. According to officials, it normally began in a hand or arm and could later spread to the rest of the body. The report showed a frightened man being guided toward an ambulance by 2 paramedics. He appeared completely normal until his right arm suddenly swung backward and grabbed one of the paramedics by the face shield. The man immediately began apologizing. He kept repeating, "That wasn't me. I didn't do that." The footage cut away before the paramedic managed to free himself. The reporter explained that affected people remained conscious throughout these episodes. In more advanced cases, the condition could interfere with balance, speech, and voluntary movement. Officials continued insisting that the symptoms were temporary and that specialist teams were being sent into affected neighborhoods. The narrator looked at their parents and said, "I guess it wasn't a prank." Neither of them answered. Dad's right hand was resting on his knee, opening and closing in a slow, steady rhythm. His fingers curled into a fist, relaxed, and then curled again. It was too even to look like a nervous habit. It almost seemed as though the hand was testing how each finger worked. The narrator called his name. The movement stopped immediately. Dad looked down, rubbed his palm against his jeans, and complained about pins and needles. Mom was holding a mug in one hand and stirring it with a teaspoon, but there was nothing inside. The spoon continued scraping around the empty ceramic cup, making the same small, irritating sound over and over. The narrator pointed out that the mug was empty. Mom looked down as though she had only just noticed. For a moment, the stirring stopped. Then her hand began moving again. "Mom, I know," she said through clenched teeth. On television, the reporter warned viewers to avoid unnecessary travel. 1 second later, Mom quietly repeated the sentence. She used exactly the same rhythm and tone as the presenter. Dad turned toward her. Mom looked at him. Then both parents turned toward the narrator at exactly the same moment. The movement was so sudden and so perfectly synchronized that the narrator took a step backward. When asked what was wrong, they pretended it was nothing. Dad's hand began opening and closing again. The narrator asked whether either parent felt numb. Both of them answered no at exactly the same time. The single word left their mouths in perfect synchronization. Dad laughed afterward, but the sound felt forced. The narrator said they were going upstairs to check Danny's messages. Danny had sent several videos. The first showed a woman sitting on her kitchen floor while her left hand repeatedly reached for the front door. She had wrapped her other arm around the wrist, using her entire body to drag it back. But every time she loosened her grip, the hand stretched toward the lock again. The person filming kept reminding her not to restrain it. Another video had already been deleted. A third showed a man sitting beside his laptop. His hand was typing without him looking at the screen. He was crying, insisting that he wasn't controlling it. The hand had filled the page with the same 3 words. "Let them in." again and again and again. Danny's final message said that her brother had started doing it too. One of his hands had opened the back door, while the other desperately tried to pull it shut. The narrator called her immediately. The call went straight to voicemail. The government website described the illness as a temporary neuromuscular condition. It claimed there was no evidence of person-to-person transmission, and that losing consciousness was uncommon. The posts on social media were far less reassuring. People claimed that the episodes became longer as the condition progressed. At first, a hand might move for only a few seconds. Later, an entire arm could act independently. After that, people began repeating words they had heard, speaking in unfamiliar tones, or walking somewhere without choosing to. One post described it as a parasite, although nobody seemed to know where that information came from. According to the account, it entered the nervous system and spread slowly, controlling the body in short bursts while it learned how everything worked. The stronger it became, the longer those periods lasted. Eventually, the person underneath was only allowed control for a few seconds at a time, and it almost always began in the non-dominant hand. The narrator was right-handed. Their left hand was resting beside the laptop as they scrolled through the posts. They tried to lift it. Nothing happened. There was no numbness and no pain. They could feel every finger pressed against the desk. The arm simply refused to respond. Before the narrator had time to panic, the hand moved on its own. It slid across the trackpad, guided the cursor toward the corner of the screen, and closed the browser. A few seconds later, control returned so suddenly that the narrator struck their arm against the edge of the desk. They flexed every finger, turned the hand over, and tried to convince themselves it had only been a spasm. Then they reopened the laptop. The browser history had been cleared. A white van pulled up outside. It had no markings apart from a small blue symbol near the rear doors. 3 people in protective clothing and clear face shields began walking toward the house across the street. Mr. and Mrs. Ellis had lived there for as long as the narrator could remember. Mr. Ellis opened the door while his wife stood behind him, holding one arm tightly against her body. Even from the upstairs window, the narrator could see her hand twisting and reaching toward the workers. Mrs. Ellis kept pulling her arm back, but each time she did, the hand stretched outward again. The workers restrained her and began guiding her toward the van. At first, she sounded embarrassed, trying to explain that only her arm was affected. Then the rear doors opened, and she began to scream. There were already people inside. Some sat quietly. Others had been strapped into their seats. One man pressed his face between the seats and shouted that he could prove he was still conscious if they would only ask him questions. His body thrashed against the restraints, but his voice sounded completely normal. Mrs. Ellis's arm reached toward the nearest worker, while the rest of her body twisted away. She kept shouting, "I'm not doing that, please, I'm not doing that." Then the doors closed behind her. Someone knocked on the narrator's bedroom door. Dad asked to be let inside. His voice sounded normal, but the narrator kept the door locked. He said they needed to talk. When asked whether everything was all right, Dad replied, "Of course I am." From somewhere behind him, Mum repeated the same words in exactly the same tone. Dad lowered his voice and said the medical teams were checking houses. He suggested telling them about Mum. The narrator asked what was wrong with her. There was a pause. Then Mum repeated, "What about Mum?" From downstairs came the familiar sound of the teaspoon scraping around the empty mug. The narrator accused Dad of acting strangely too. After a few seconds, both parents walked away, their footsteps moving down the corridor at exactly the same pace. Another video appeared online. It had been filmed secretly from inside one of the vans. A woman whispered into her phone while people cried around her. She explained that medical teams were separating patients according to how far the condition had progressed. Some could still fight it. Some lost control for several minutes. Others only seemed to regain control for a few seconds. A teenage boy sitting opposite her looked directly at the camera. His body remained completely still, while one finger slowly lifted to his lips. The video ended. A government warning appeared above the video, urging people not to trust unverified claims about parasites or permanent loss of control. The narrator's left hand began moving toward the laptop again. This time, they caught the wrist with their right hand. Fingers twitched against their grip, pulling toward the keyboard. For several seconds, the hand fought them. Then it stopped. Control returned, but only after the page had vanished from the screen. Someone knocked on the front door downstairs. A voice called out, "Medical assistance. We're carrying out household checks." Mum responded immediately. "Coming." The narrator ran from the bedroom. Dad was standing with his right hand on the lock. Mum stood beside him, silently moving her lips in time with the words being spoken outside. The narrator told them not to open the door. Dad looked back and insisted that they had to. He said the workers were helping people. Mum repeated the same sentence a moment later, her voice completely flat. Dad's hand turned the lock. His expression changed instantly. He looked down at his fingers, as though he had only just understood what they were doing. "No," he whispered. His hand pulled the door open anyway. The workers entered quickly. Dad tried to move backward, but his arm reached toward one of them instead. Mum's hand grabbed a worker's sleeve while the rest of her body pulled desperately in the opposite direction. One of the workers sprayed something onto her wrist. Her grip loosened, and they moved in before either parent could resist again. Dad shouted that he was fine. Mum insisted that she was still herself. Halfway through the sentence, her voice changed. "Still myself," she repeated. "Still myself, still myself." The words came out in exactly the same tone, even while tears ran down her face. Then, just as suddenly, Mum seemed to regain control. She looked at the narrator and cried, "Please, don't let them take you as well." The workers pulled both parents outside. The narrator remained near the stairs, with their left hand hidden inside the pocket of a hoodie. One worker stayed behind. She asked whether anyone else was inside the house, and whether the narrator had experienced numbness, involuntary movement, or unexplained repetition. The narrator answered no to every question. The worker asked to see both hands. The right came out first, then, very slowly, the left. The narrator expected it to twist toward the worker, or reveal itself in some obvious way. Instead, it hung loosely at their side. The worker asked the narrator to turn both hands over, spread the fingers, and touch each fingertip to the thumb. Both hands obeyed perfectly. She checked their pupils and asked more questions. Every answer came without hesitation. Outside, the parents were being loaded into the van. The worker concluded that the narrator appeared unaffected. The narrator opened their mouth, intending to confess. But before the words could leave, the left hand pressed its fingernails sharply into the palm. The warning was clear. After the worker left, the narrator locked the door and stood alone in the hallway. The left hand remained perfectly still. Somehow, that was more frightening than when it moved. A new alert arrived shortly afterward. Evacuation notice. Residents without symptoms should prepare one small bag and wait for authorized transport. Do not leave your property until instructed. The moment the narrator finished reading, the left hand took control. It pulled out a backpack, packed a charger, a clean shirt, and a toothbrush. When it saw the workers approaching farther down the street, it picked up a coat. By the time they returned to the house, the hand had gone still again. The narrator was tested a second time before being allowed onto the bus. They walked in a straight line, followed instructions, and held both hands out while the workers watched for movement. The body obeyed perfectly. Around 30 people were taken to a temporary safe center inside a school on the other side of the city. Every one of them had passed the same tests. They were given green wristbands, marking them as unaffected, and assigned beds in the auditorium. The narrator began writing the story in pieces. They wanted somebody to know that their parents were still conscious when they were taken. Even when their bodies moved without permission, they were still inside. At first, the narrator had assumed their own infection was weaker because it only controlled the hand for a few seconds at a time. Now they understood the truth. It wasn't weak. It was being careful. It knew when the worker was testing them. It packed the bag because it wanted to come to the safe center. Hundreds of people filled the auditorium, all wearing green wristbands. A woman nearby tapped 4 times against the frame of her bed, paused, and then repeated the pattern. The man beside her began copying it. Soon, the same tapping could be heard from the other side of the room. Whenever a worker passed, it stopped. An announcement came through the speakers, telling everyone that the facility was secure. A woman near the doors repeated the message in exactly the same voice. Then a man beside her did the same. More people joined in. Slowly, everyone began turning toward the doors. The narrator's left hand had stopped trying to close the page. It was resting calmly beside the keyboard. The narrator had assumed it hid because it was afraid of being discovered. They were wrong. It knew this was where the authorities were bringing everyone who could still pass as unaffected And now they were all in the same room. Okay. Yeah, that one is definitely going to stay in my head for a while. The part that creeped me out the most wasn't even the hand moving on its own. It was the fact that it knew when to stop. It wasn't just controlling people. It was paying attention, learning how the tests worked, and waiting until nobody was watching. And then the safe center turns out to be full of people who all pass those same tests. Yeah. No, I think I'd be checking both of my hands for the rest of the night, especially the non-dominant one. And I think that's where we'll leave the stories for today. This episode was a little different from what we normally do, but I actually really enjoyed trying something darker for a change. So if you liked the creepy stories and you'd like to hear more episodes like this, definitely let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed hanging out with me, a like or a subscribe always means a lot. Totally optional, of course, but it really does help. Thank you for spending some time with me. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night, and maybe keep an eye on your left hand.